it's hard to come up with a question about relating to the spiritual teacher that Lama Zopa doesn't answer in this book really clearly. So it's called The Heart of the Path, Seeing the Guru as Buddha is the subtitle. And if you go on the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive, what's called website, you can order it there. I'm sure it's also on Amazon and stuff, but you can order it directly from them if you want to. Most of their books are free. I think this one costs $20 because it's so big.
Yeah, that one's $20.
That they couldn't give it away for free, maybe, or something. But
yeah.
But it really clearly answers lots of questions, and it's Lama Zopa's Rinpoche's direct words, and he tells a lot of stories in there. But he goes through all the actual teachings in a really clear way. So I would recommend that one if you're interested. It's the best book I've ever seen on the subject of Guru, relating to the Guru, relating to the spiritual teaching. And then the other thing people had asked, I just wanted to say, is that so Gabe reminded me, and somebody else reminded on email, that there are different translations of the life of Milarepa. And so any translation is okay, is acceptable. The one that I personally read and liked very much, is it's by Gelugpa, Lobsang T. Gelugpa's translation. But any translation will do. I mean, it's the same story. But Gelugpa's translation is quite nice. It's nicely written, and I think it's the later of the two that are in English. Usually the later ones often are better because there's been more time for language to develop and sort of glitches in translation to be fixed. And he's quite a good translator. So the Life of Milarepa, you can read any of the translations, but Lobsang T. Gelugpa's translation is quite good.
Can you spell that? L-A?
I think it's L-A. Lobsang is Lobsang, L-O-B-S-A-N-G, but I think the last name is L-H, if I remember right. L-H-A, and then L-U-N-G-P-A, probably. That's probably it. I'm not 100% sure. And I'll just say too, like if you, I really do recommend, if you haven't read it, to read The Life of Milarepa. It's one of the, in addition to being a great teaching, I think it's fair to say that it's also just one of the great works of literature. It's and probably one of the best autobiographies ever. It's just up there with other great stories. And Tibetan, it's probably I don't think there is any story more popular among Tibetans. There's no story that Tibetans probably know better than The Life of Milarepa. And it's a very moving story. It's just a beautiful, it's a beautiful story also of it's a true story, right? Because it's his life, but it's also it's a very moving, it almost reads like a novel. And the characters are quite entertaining, and it's not at all a dry story. He's a quite entertaining person. His teacher Marpa is really wild, and his mother. The characters are very memorable, and it's a beautiful story. And it's the kind of, and I don't know what the right way to say it is. And it's, there's a certain archetype to Buddhist stories. Usually, most Buddhist stories follow the life of the Buddha. Like if you read Atisha's biography, it's almost the same. You read it, and you think, wow, his biography is very similar to the Buddha's, right? If you read it in the Lam Rim, right? He was also a prince, and his father didn't want him to be, a yogi, and then he went off. And of course, their details are different, but the general archetype is the same. The Life of Milarepa is completely opposite. He was, totally different, right? He was poor, and wasn't so perfect early in his life. Did some pretty bad things. So it's also a very human story. So anyway, I just very highly recommend it, and I think a lot of people when they read it, it changes. It helps their actual spiritual practice too. It did that for me very much, and I think it did for a lot of other people too. So I just highly recommend it. Milarepa's life story. Actually, if you read it, you may end up wanting to read. There's one thing, for some reason they've done a good job translating. So there's a whole line of teachers, right, that were Tilopa taught Naropa, Naropa taught Marpa, Marpa taught Milarepa, and Milarepa taught Gempopa. So it's a particular historical period of right when Buddhism was coming to Tibet. And all those biographies have been translated into English, actually. So you may find, I found that when I read the life and story of Milarepa, I loved it so much that then I was like, well, now I have to read Marpa's biography. And I was like, Marpa was mentioning, now I have to read Naropa's, and then now, this Gelugpa, his teacher, I have to read, so kind of when Milarepa's was the archetypal story, but then you get interested enough, you want to, and then I was like, once you get back to Gelugpa, there was nobody previous, particularly to read, who's been in English, but then I was like, okay, we got Popa, the student, So all those are in English. Actually, it's a nice period of history that's also been translated in an extensive way. And they're all fascinating. All of them are really interesting characters. The life of Naropa also teaches Guru devotion in a fascinating way. He's a little. His story is a little similar to Milarepa's. It's different in the sense that he was a monk and left the monastery, but it's similar in the sense of going through incredible hard. I guess all those characters, not Gampopa so much, but Naropa, Marpa, and Milarepa, they all went through incredible hardships in their spiritual practice. That's quite moving. So if you read any of those stories, it'll also make you appreciate how easy it is in our time to, see Lama Zopa or hit YouTube. You can see it teaching. Marpa had to walk across the Himalayas over and over, so it's a lot easier. He didn't have YouTube. But okay, so should we maybe we should probably do like we usually do, just meditate for a few minutes. We'll just do. Everybody here knows how, so I won't guide it because all you guys know how to do. So I'll just do like 10 or 12 minutes of just silent meditation. together, let's do just a brief contemplation. And so, for this first contemplation, I was just to bring to mind one teacher. For this particular exercise, for this particular one, it doesn't have to be a spiritual teacher, but just somebody in your life who taught you something meaningful for you. So it could be, just pick one, right? But it could be somebody from when you were in school, when you were in grade school or high school or college, or it could be somebody related to your work, right, at some point, who mentored you in some way. It could be a family member who taught you some valuable life lesson. But just pick one example of a person who taught you something that was useful, helpful to you, and who played an important role in that way. Somewhere along the way, right? Whether it was a professor, or an aunt or uncle, boss, or an older friend. Just spend a few minutes now, like thinking about that person, and thinking about two different things, right? One is the practical help they gave you, and how it affected your life or your development. And also, related to that is their kindness to you. So that's another to contemplate. In connection with the practical things they taught you, there's also what value their own example may bring to you. That's different than just information they may have shared or a practical skill they may have revealed. But also, was their example in some way meaningful to you? Did it affect you in any way? And you can even think about how would your life have been different or be different if you hadn't come across that teacher, or if you hadn't had that experience with them today. trying to decide which order to talk about. Maybe I'll start with that. Maybe I'll say a few things and I want to interact some today, but I think I'll start by just talking a little bit, like, so on the one hand, I thought a reasonable start is like, since this is the first class in the module and like relating to a spiritual teacher, right? So it seems reasonable to start with one point, which is kind of the simple point of why, why would somebody need a spiritual teacher? Why is that important? And I think it depends, I think it's fair to say that it depends, it depends on what one's goal is, actually, right? Like, because actually, let's say if somebody's only goal was to do some breathing meditation in order to calm down and have less stress, like then maybe you don't need a spiritual teacher, actually. Right? You could look on YouTube or something and learn that, right? Or you could read a book and learn that. So actually, I think that's not really spiritual practice. Actually, from a Buddhist point of view, that's not really a spiritual practice. That's a health, that's like a health concern or something. Even then, you'll do better at it if you have somebody to teach you, but it's not actually, for that I don't think it's required, actually. And then also, like, if you just want to, so I guess, like, it depends, like, in Buddhism, like, a spiritual teacher means what's the definition of spiritual, actually, right? Like, so it raises that question. So from a Buddhist point of view, right, we've talked about this before, so that spiritual practice, like in other words, actual Dharma practice, right? Spiritual teacher means Dharma, like Dharma practice, spiritual teacher, Dharma teacher. So like, Dharma practice means, right, you have to, like, you're not practicing Dharma unless you've entered the lowest scope, right? Upper Rim, upper stages of the path, which is the scope where you're trying to achieve a better future rebirth, at least, right? But then for most of us, then it goes beyond that, right? There's an idea of wanting to escape from samsara, and then also of wanting to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, right? Like bodhicitta. So the idea is, if you're doing those kind of practices, right? If that's your motivation, is actual Dharma practice, then for sure you do need a spiritual teacher, is what Buddha said, actually. And so this is fairly straightforward, right? Because those are actually, if you think about like the practices to achieve liberation or achieve full enlightenment, they're quite complicated, right? And so it's fair to give an analogy. And actually, analogies like this are often given. I think Lama's Overtree gives some analogies like this, but we could apply different ones, right? So, for example, like it's like this: if you fall down and skin your knee and you need a Band-Aid, like, do you need a doctor? No. And do you need an expert surgeon to do that? No. But if somebody has needs open heart surgery, right? Or has or needs brain surgery, then actually, would you go to a doctor who said, "Well, I learned it all from a book. I never went to medical school, but I read a lot of books on surgery, and don't worry, the books were really good. They were well-written books, and they had some good drawings, and I could do open heart surgery." There's no way in the world, right? Like, in other words, you would want someone who's done a lot of surgeries with somebody more experienced, right, with previous surgeons. And the same applies, right? Because we're talking about complicated tasks, right? And the same goes, actually, you wouldn't even go in a car with somebody. Even when teenagers want to learn how to drive, right, they have to learn from somebody. Right? Some of you guys have probably taught teenagers. So, like, you wouldn't even learn how to drive, which is not that complicated a task, right? But you wouldn't even go in a car with somebody if they hadn't learned from somebody else. But then imagine if you got on an airplane, right, and the airplane pilot said, "Well, I've read some books. I've never really flown a plane before, but I think I can do this 747. That's no big deal, because I saw a lot of movies also about airplanes. Like, we have a pilot here, so would that be safe? Definitely not, right? So any complicated, the point here is that any complicated task actually is not enough, right, to just have read about it. Does that make sense? Like, whereas if it's something very simple, like actually though, I was going to say, I'm not sure. Even going for a walk, actually, right? Somebody had to help a little bit, right? Usually somebody's mom or dad helped them when they were first learning how to walk. That's kind of natural, but still you need somebody to help you. So the point is that most tasks, we do need a teacher, right? And for complicated tasks, for sure, right? Right, and the same thing, right? Like, we're in DC, so there's a lot of engineering firms, right? Like, could you imagine if somebody said, I want a job at one of these major engineering firms because I've read a lot of books on engineering. Well, did you go to school and study? No, right? In other words, it's not going to get a job. So I guess for most tasks, I guess you could say we need a teacher. And then for the more complicated the task is, the more necessary the teacher is, right? And especially if a task is complicated and critically important, right? That's why if you think of like the brain surgery or heart surgery, those are really important, right? Or flying an airplane, because their life and death matters. Right? And so the idea here is that a few things. One is the spiritual path, right? Spiritual practice. The view of Buddhism is a few things. One is that spiritual practice is extremely is complicated like that. It's actually an inner technology, right, of transforming yourself. And if you actually study like just the right, the 9 levels of calm abiding and the and then the all the different things you have to do on that, or if you want to study emptiness, right, and all the different mistakes that you can make and the subtleties of the view, or if you want to really understand how to generate bodhicitta, those kind of examples, right? Those are they're not simple things like putting on a band-aid. They're fairly complex tasks. So one is, it's complicated, so you need a teacher, right? And then another is, it's critically important, right? And actually I think Pabonka Rinpoche talks about that a little bit, right? He says like, he points out like, well actually, like when I, you guys know because while I was teaching, right? When I needed back surgery, right? Like I did a lot of research, right? Like I didn't just say, oh well, who's the closest back surgeon? I'll go to them, right? Like I called and spoke to my cousin who's a nurse, then I called her friend who's a neurosurgeon in Texas, and got his advice about what qualities to look for in a back surgeon. I wrote them down. I made a list, right? He said if you want to come to Texas, fine. Otherwise, look for somebody like this. I remember actually it was funny. I said to him, he was a neurosurgeon. I said, well, is it better to do have a neurosurgeon? Who's better at this, a neurosurgeon or a orthopedic surgeon? He said, well, they're both good. And I said, well, but I hear a lot of stories of failed back surgeries. People have back surgery and then it failed. He said, those are orthopedic surgeons. I'm not sure he was a neurosurgeon, so it wasn't surprising. But so I thought, okay, I'll look for a neurosurgeon. But I looked at, so when I did research, right, I looked at where'd they go to school, where'd they do their internship, what hospitals are they affiliated with, what, the guy who I chose went to NYU and went to, he had gone to schools that were well known to be good at this kind of thing, right? Then like what affiliations they have, what awards have they won, what practice are they part of, how long have they been in practice, are they too young or too old, are they, have they done a lot of this particular kind of surgery, what's their specialization, even if they're great surgeons, is this a surgery they do often, so they did a lot of like research like that, right, to choose somebody who, and then went to meet and then after I had done all that, right, then I went to meet the person and still I would have not used them if I didn't think they seemed competent and smart and organized and right, and like they would do a good job, and also the hospital, same thing, right? Like what hospital's good and which hospital's the right one to have this kind of surgery, and even if it's further, it's worth it because it's important, right? So you don't want to just go, oh well, this hospital's the nearest one to my house. That's easy, like you don't do that, right? If it's a major thing. So I'm just giving an example, right? So Pabonka Rinpoche says, if for something like that only affects that the effect is only for one lifetime, you do all that, then if you have some understanding of Dharma, you should do way more research for a spiritual teacher, and what, and a spiritual place, right? Like what places you want to affiliate with, and what teachers you want to affiliate with. Like, and so sometimes, like actually Lama Zopa says this, he says sometimes, so then people will go, oh, so-and-so Rinpoche is coming to town, I'm going to go to the initiation, and they're giving this big initiation, I'm going. Right, and people go to the initiation. And like, that's totally, like that, if you do that without researching and thinking, that's wrong. Actually, that's not a good approach to spiritual. That'd be the equivalent of like saying, that'd be equivalent, I don't know, like we stopped at McDonald's. Like if I were to call through to the McDonald's, the lady serving, well, who do you think is a good surgeon or something? Oh, okay, I'll go there. Like, whereas like with no research at all, like in other words, that's like, well, I just heard this. Okay, I heard something's happening, I'll go there. That's totally a wrong view, right? Like, and it means, if you do that, it means that you don't, first of all, you haven't studied, right, what qualities to look for in a spiritual teacher, but also that you're not really understanding the importance of a spiritual teacher. Does that make sense? Because, then somehow something's wrong in your understanding of how important the spiritual path is if you just do it like kind of randomly like that. Does that make sense? because you should. So I guess what I'm getting at here is the reason why it's important. One is it's complicated, but another is that it's a very important decision. Actually, right? It's an important thing in your life, and many teachers say this, right? Like Lama Tsongkhapa, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and many other teachers say, that if you choose the wrong people to be your teacher, and even if you have one teacher and then you choose another, it's like, if you choose somebody who's not a good choice, then it's about as bad as choosing a really bad surgeon. Like, whereas if you say, well, I had a good heart surgeon, but I chose a bad brain surgeon, no big deal, right? Like that doesn't work that way, right? Like, in other words, so if you have to, so each time you have to check carefully. Is the point there? Does that make sense, kind of? Like, and why? It's because it's an important choice. So okay, that leads to the next thing I would say. So also it makes it harder for us, I think, as Westerners, because it can be confusing with Tibetan. Like, in other words, there's a cross-cultural factor here, right? And so then it can be a little difficult, because how do you do your research? First of all, you can't read Tibetan, and secondly, there are all these words that aren't even clear. So I wanted to just very briefly go through something. So first of all, like, there are a lot of different words that we hear, right? Actually, you can see them in advertisements, and then also you just hear them, right? Like, so first of all, I'll just go through a bunch of them. So venerable, right? So one word you hear is venerable. What does venerable mean usually? Actually, usually in the context of the way Buddhism has been translated into English, venerable means somebody's a monk or a nun. So that means they've taken some vows, right? So that in and of itself doesn't mean anything about whether they're a spiritual teacher. Does that make sense? There's like lots of people lots of people have monk or nun vows and wouldn't want to teach, would hate the idea of teaching, and wouldn't be a good teacher, and haven't necessarily studied much. Right? I mean, actually, like, there are 4-year-old kids who are venerable, 5-year-old kids who are venerable. So that doesn't mean they're a good choice for a teacher. Right? Then another one is toku, right? What's a toku? A toku means, actually, technically, really what a toku is supposed, like the word toku in Tibetan is nirmanaka, actually. So it's supposed to mean like the physical form of a Buddha. But in Tibetan culture, it doesn't mean that, actually. I mean, it does mean that, but it also doesn't. It's used other ways also. So in Tibetan culture, toku has come to mean, right, somebody a reincarnate lama, right, somebody who was recognized in their childhood or at some point in their life as being the reincarnation of somebody else. And Tibetans tend to have a lot of respect for tokus. And sometimes, actually, you can almost get the feeling that just because somebody's the toku of somebody who used to be very impressive in a previous life, that, they're like, Tibetans look like this, and then it's like they're a spiritual teacher. But actually, that's definitely not the sign that you should take that person as your spiritual teacher. There's like the Buddha didn't say take somebody who somebody said is the reincarnation of somebody else as your spiritual teacher. And actually, as long as the Dalai Lama and also actually one of my teachers, Geshe Kenra, was very kind. He used to say, basically, I mean, he used his words. Basically, he would say, "Prove it." In other words, like, you're supposed to be the reincarnation of somebody. Well, if your behavior and teachings don't show that, then it's not really. Then, in other words, not to disrespect the person, but from my point of view, that doesn't help me, right? Whereas this person is the reincarnation of Naropa or of Milarepa or of somebody, right? Or of Lama Tsongkhapa. Somebody said, they're the reincarnation of Lama Tsongkhapa. Lama Tsongkhapa said, don't look for reincarnation, so there isn't one, right? But if somebody said that, right? But then the person didn't study and doesn't teach Buddhism and, is doing something else. Well, how does that help me? I mean, internally they may have those qualities, but it's not helping me one speck, so that's not the right quality to look for. Does that make sense? So just because somebody's labeled a toku, that doesn't mean they're supposed to be your teacher. Then there's the word Rinpoche, right? Which actually all of, like our center, we always call it Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Kensei Rinpoche, right? Rinpoche. So the word Rinpoche actually means precious in Tibetan. Right? And the title Rinpoche tends to be given, first of all, automatically to somebody who is a toku, right? So when they're a little kid, they say, like the little boy of my teacher's reincarnation, right? They say Rinpoche, so now the little boy is called Rinpoche. Right? But he's 5, so it wouldn't be smart to take him as a guru, right? So Rinpoche doesn't qualify somebody. And then also sometimes people start to get the title Rinpoche if they're an abbot, right? Like Kensei Rinpoche. He wasn't recognized as a toku, because he was abbot of Gyume Tantric College, then they say, oh, Khyentse Rinpoche. So usually retired abbots, then they call him Rinpoche, which is a title of respect in Tibetan culture, but the title in and of itself doesn't qualify somebody to be a spiritual teacher. Does that make sense? Then there's the title Geshe, right? Geshe so-and-so, right? We use that one a lot too. So actually Geshe originally meant like a virtuous friend, actually, right? Like a Kalyana Mitra is the Sanskrit that Geshe means. Nowadays in Tibetan culture it doesn't mean that anymore. Now it means somebody who achieved a degree from a monastic college. And so just because somebody earned a degree from a monastic college does not, it means they've studied something, right? They have some knowledge of Buddhism. But that in and of itself doesn't mean they're fully qualified to be a spiritual teacher. It's a good thing. It means they've studied. Just like venerable is a good thing. It means they've taken vows, but it doesn't necessarily in and of itself, that's not enough to say, oh, for sure this person should be my spiritual teacher. Right? There are people who have the title Geshe who don't have important qualities of a spiritual teacher. Right? If you check, we'll go through what those are. So that's not enough to take somebody to spiritual teacher, but you should know what it means, right? It means these days if somebody says Geshe, it usually means they graduated from a monastic college, and there are different levels of Geshe, right, according to how much study they did. But it doesn't prove that they've had any realization. It doesn't prove that Geshe doesn't prove that somebody's even an ethical person, right? Actually, I mean, most of them are, but it doesn't prove it in and of itself, right? It just proves they went through a college degree program. Go through other ones. Okay, I'll go do two more, or three more. So then there's the word Kenpo and Kensur. And Kenpo, actually, they have different meanings even in different traditions. In the Gelugpa tradition, Kenpo is somebody who's currently an abbot. And then Kensur is an abbot emeritus, a former abbot. So Kensur, when we say Khyentse Rinpoche, it means precious former abbot, right? Precious abbot emeritus. Actually, that's what that means. Sometimes in the Nyingma and Kagyu traditions, Kenpo can actually be more like their equivalent to Geshe. Actually, it just means that they've finished a monastic course of study. So that's what that. So it has a slightly. It can mean something different. It can also mean abbot, but it can also mean somebody who finished a certain course of study, and they don't do Geshe degree, so they do Kenpo degree. So that would mean that, right? And again, because somebody was an abbot, does that mean they're qualified to be your spiritual teacher? May or may not, actually, right? Not necessarily. And then the last term I want to go over is lama, which is a Tibetan translation of the word guru, which technically means heavy, actually, heavy with good qualities. That's the technical definition. But in terms of choosing a teacher, right? Actually, nowadays, if you look actually on online or lots of people have the word lama. Actually, there are a lot of Tibetans, but also a lot of Western people have the word lama. And actually, so it's actually funny in Buddhist philosophy. Actually, in the teachings on logic, they say, what makes something suitable? What makes this suitable to be called a cup? Well, there's nothing about this in and of itself. It's called something else in other languages, right? Whereas it's just a convention. So if people agree to call it a cup, then it's called a cup. So in one way, you have to be a little careful, right? Because the word lama is the same thing, right? In other words, if three people say, "Oh, so and so's a lama," well then, actually, you can't say, "No, you can't call him a lama," right? How could you debate that, right? No, that's not suitable. Well, those three people agree this person's a lama. So okay, so then they're a lama, right? Or a guru or something. So in that sense, a lama can mean, in one sense, in one level, saying somebody's a lama just means somebody thinks they're a lama, right? Somebody said, "Oh, I think they're my lama," right? So if I were walking down the street and I saw something and I said, "Oh, that's my lama," I just decided. Well, actually, you can't really debate with me and say, "No, they're not," right? If I say, "Well, to me they are," okay, whereas you can't really debate that. So what we have to be a little careful, right? The word lama can be, or guru can be ascribed to anybody, technically. Right? But then actually the qualities of a lama, right? Really a lama should be, but also, I'll say a couple more things. Also, sometimes in Tibet, some places they just call any monk a lama. They say, "Oh, lama so-and-so." There are some monasteries where they just do that, and it doesn't really mean much. It's just, it's like "Oh, lama so-and-so and lama so-and-so." Then also there are some traditions where anybody who's completed a 3-year retreat is called a lama. And then it's sort of like, because they know the rituals and something like that, you know, that doesn't mean they have all the qualities that one would have. So there are a lot of different things, but actually, you know, ultimately, according to, like, if you study the Lam Rim, then somebody, you know, really, if you choose somebody for your Lama, and you've studied Lam Rim well, the stages of the path well, then ideally your choice of a Lama should have the qualities we're about to go over. Does that make sense? So, like, just because somebody else calls somebody a Lama, that just means they call them a Lama, right? But for us, what my advice is, it's not just mine, it comes from Lama Tsongkhapa, so is if you're going to choose somebody to be your Lama, and actually, well, two things. One is they should have the qualities we're about to go over. And secondly, you should be able to relate to them either as a representative of the Buddha or as an emanation of the Buddha. So it's quite a serious title then. Because if you're going to say, I view this person as my Lama, right, then either you're representing them, you're viewing them as a representative of the Buddha, or you're viewing them as an actual Buddha in a sense, or an emanation of the Buddha. Or something. So then it's quite a serious title, actually, right? Guru, in that sense. So we have to, you know what we mean by it. But okay, so now I just want to go over. So what are the qualities of a spiritual teacher in the sense of a Lama, right? Like somebody you're going to take to be your Lama. And I want to emphasize first is that it depends, like there are different qualities listed for different levels of teacher. That makes sense, right? So it's different to be a general practitioner than to be a brain surgeon, right? You should have different qualities. And actually, okay, so and then I'll tell a brief story that relates to this one. I think I've told it, some of you may have heard it before, but one time I was in San Jose, California. They were opening a new center there, a new FPMT center, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Rinpa Rinpoche were both there. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche was introducing Rinpa Rinpoche, right? Because Rinpa Rinpoche was going to say something. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche gave a very profound teaching, I thought, in his introduction to Rinpa Rinpoche. What he said was, you know, this is my guru, my Lama, Rinpa Rinpoche. And he would get like very moved or something. And then he said, who has all the qualities of that a spiritual teacher should have. And then he didn't just say that, he started listing them. And he went through 30 different qualities, explaining how he showed through reason that Rinpa Rinpoche had each of these 30 qualities. So it was a long introduction, usually you try to do introductions brief, Lama Zopa Rinpoche didn't do a brief one. So he did like a long one. So he went through 30, and he was going like this, and each one showing the reasoning why he could say that Rinpa Rinpoche had that quality. Right? So he went through all 30 qualities and said, so therefore he's a completely valid guru, a completely valid Lama, completely valid refuge. He has all the qualities of a spiritual teacher. So then, and then he said, so okay, thank you. So Rinpa Rinpoche, please. So then Rinpa Rinpoche says, well, I want you all to know that my student, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, also has all 30 qualities. Then he started, and he started explaining why Lama Zopa Rinpoche had all 30 qualities, which was quite funny. But also very profound teaching, actually, right? What Lama Zopa Rinpoche was showing, one was that Rinpa Rinpoche was a fully qualified teacher, but the other was that he had checked, right? He didn't just, even though Rinpa Rinpoche was, from an external point of view, you can say, well, Rinpa Rinpoche, he had the title Rinpoche, right? He was also an elder monk. He was, he was a famous Lama, and he'd been a student of Pabonka Rinpoche, and he was, had many different things. Like he was very close to the Dalai Lama, but those weren't the basis, right? It wasn't that Lama Zopa didn't say because he has the title Rinpoche. He didn't mention that. He didn't say because he's close to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he didn't say because he was this great yogi for 7 previous lifetimes or whatever it was. Like, he didn't mention any of those things, actually, right? And he didn't say because he's a famous Lama or because he studied with Pabonka Rinpoche in Tibet and was very close with them or was very close to. He didn't mention any of those things. He went through these actual qualities. Does that make sense? So he was showing how to choose a spiritual teacher. He was saying, don't pick somebody just because they're famous. Don't pick somebody just because they're eloquent. Don't pick somebody just because they're charismatic. None of those are these qualities. Does that make sense? He was showing how to choose one. So I think it's really important that we know this. Okay, so we'll go through. So I'm going to go through the 10 qualities of a Mahayana teacher. Okay, and these were taught by Maitreya, actually. And so, so we'll go through those because that's important, I think. And then we'll see if we want to go through Vajrayana or not, but definitely if you're going to choose somebody for your teacher, it'd be good if they have these. I was just checking. So this was taught by Maitreya in the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, the Sutra, Mahayana Sutra Alamkara. So the first quality, and actually there's a reason why this one comes first, so really think about that, okay? That the very first quality is they should be well trained in ethics or morality. Right? So that's quite important, right? And that actually, this one in particular, among the ones we're about to go over, this one's the easiest, this one in some way, I would say that actually, it's the easiest one to check up on, actually, right? So what does that mean? In other words, in Buddhism, that's very clear. This is not like some difficult thing to understand, right? A person who's well trained in morality should be keeping the 10, should be not performing the 10 non-virtuous actions, and should be performing the 10 virtuous actions, right? Also, if they have vows, they should be keeping their vows, right? So that's not so hard to check up on, actually, right? Like, in other words, if you ask around and you observe the teacher and you ask other people and you check on the internet and you look people up and you, whereas this is one like, just like with that surgeon, or you can check this, right? Is there any sign that this person is not well trained in morality, right? And also they should be emphasized, another way to check that is they should also be emphasizing morality in their teaching to their students, right? So does that make sense? That that's the easiest one of all these to check because you can check it externally, actually, right? Or so if you catch the person lying, right, or cheating, right, or things like that, and if you don't check, if in other words, if just you say, oh, they're wearing monk's robes, so I think there must be moral, right? That's not well trained in morality, right? Because actually somebody could steal a pair of monk's robes and put them on. There are stories like that, right, where people did that actually. You know, so that in other words, so just because they're wearing monk's robes doesn't prove they're moral. Actually, their behavior, in other words, it's a behavioral thing, right? Because most of them are trained, right? Of the 10 non-virtues, 7 of them are external, and then 3 are internal, right? Covetousness and ill will. And this one's really important, isn't it? Because if you choose a teacher who you haven't checked if they're moral, and then later you find out that they aren't, right? That they're cheating in some way, and that happens actually, right? I just want to emphasize this point actually, because that happens. In other words, people don't check up, right? And then they find out, oh, this teacher commits sexual misconduct, right? That they, like, you know, sort of sexually abuse a student or something, right? And then it's a nightmare, actually, right? For that, in other words, I took them as my spiritual teacher, then I find out they're sexually abusing people, and then like I've met people like, right? Then you're in like a very terrible situation, right? Because you have this relationship to somebody, and there's all this drama and problems and fear and anger, and you know all that stuff comes up, right? And it makes a mess of your spiritual life. And the same thing, right? If you if you choose somebody your spiritual teacher and they're stealing, right? Like it could be overt. I mean, most spiritual teachers aren't doing armed robbery, right? But there are people who like they're taking money out of the center, or they're doing some kind of they're pretending there's something they're not, they're lying, not again like sort of exaggerating their own quality, things like that, right? That kind of lying, and then again you're in a nightmare situation. Like, so then you're caught up in it, and then they're doing that, and then you're traumatized. And I've met people like this, then they're traumatized for years afterwards because they didn't check. Does that make sense? And they just chose somebody because they like seemed charismatic, but then they didn't know the person was doing some of those kind of. So morality is really important, isn't it? You see what I mean? So that one you should very carefully check, and that's not hard to check, right? You can look at your own, you can observe directly, but you can also ask around. Right? You can ask people who know them, and ask people who've studied them, who've been around for a while. You have to be a little careful. You can't ask somebody who's idealizing them, right? You have to ask. So you have to ask broadly, or check broadly. Okay. So actually, and the first 3 actually relate to the 3 higher traits. So the first is morality. Second is they should be pacified. They call it, which means they should have achieved concentration meditation. Ideally, should achieve calm abiding. Right? But they should actually have accomplished concentration meditation. I'll give an example on this one that actually with Lama Zopa I thought was interesting. Roger Kunsang, Lama Zopa's attendant, who was with him all the time, right, described how one of the signs of concentration meditation is if you can actually achieve calm abiding, right, then your sense power is shut down when you're in meditation. You enter in such a deep meditative state that you completely absorb into your object of meditation, so you no longer perceive events around you. And so this one made me laugh. So Roger Kunsang said his mom gave Lama Zopa one of those cards that when you open it, it goes, that kind of thing. And so so Roger delivered it for his mom, and Lama Zopa opened it and sort of saw what it was, and then he he put it on his, so Roger, they were both in rooms right next, like, without big walls right next to each other. So Lama Zopa puts it on his altar, opens it, offers it to the Buddha, puts it on his altar, and enters into deep meditation. And it's going for hours. And Roger's in the next room going, like, he's sitting there trying to meditate. He's going, this is driving me nuts. Like, I wish I could stop that. And finally, he tiptoes into the room and just gently closes the card and tiptoes out. Lama Zopa is in this deep meditation. So it'll be like an hour later. Roger's there, like, finally some peace, and he's starting to go to sleep. Maybe an hour or two later, and he comes back in. He says, "What Rinpoche?" And Rinpoche says, "I wanted your mom to create merit. This is really good. Leave it open. That way it's like an offering to the Buddhas. So leave it open, okay." And then Lama Zopa enters back into meditation. So he's no. And then Roger's like, "Oh, well, how long does it take for the battery and those things to run out?" Roger was really funny about that. He's like, now Lama Zopa told me to leave it open, and it's for my mom. I'm like, I'll create really some bad karma. So he couldn't, but that was an example of a sign, right, that Lama Zopa had achieved combining, where, there are sensory things don't disturb his meditation. Roger was less lucky, I think, that day, that time. Then there's another, like with Lama Zopa also, there's a sign of, if you achieve combining, you achieve mental and physical pliancy, right, which means your body can continually do virtuous actions, right. So if you look at Lama Zopa's behavior, again, this one you can check behaviorally, right, where I would think, like, when he stayed at my house a few times, right, where I would be like, after not sleeping for a day, I'm ready to collapse, and he's like, they describe it in the text, they say like light like cotton, right? Your body's like still able to, and then you can keep doing, so Lama Zopa, like, when I was like, I was much younger than him, right, and I'm ready to fall over, and Roger looks really tired, and Lama Zopa says, oh, let's put out the offerings, and let's start doing this, and I want to make offerings outside, and I want to make offerings inside, and like, this sense of being tireless and sort of light physically is a sign. So again, there are ways you can check my point. You can look and go, wow, that'd be, like, no ordinary person can do that. Be calm. This is not like manic or something, but calm and peaceful, and yet continually have energy to do virtuous things. That's a sign of having achieved combining. So you can look at somebody's behavior and go, wow, they seem to have that. Right? And then the next one is extremely pacified, they call it, which means trained in wisdom. And so, that should mean all kinds of wisdom, right? But particularly understanding emptiness, and ideally having, a good understanding of the teachings and in general, and of emptiness in particular. The fourth quality is they should have more knowledge than yourself. That's the thing. But actually, they clarify this one a little bit. Like, they give examples where they say, particularly on the subject you want to study, and they give oftentimes the example is given of Lama Atisha, because Lama Atisha actually, when he went to Indonesia, right, to see Lama Serlingpa, Atisha's view was actually higher than Serlingpa. In other words, Atisha knew more about emptiness than Serlingpa did. But Atisha didn't have the full teachings on bodhicitta and hadn't yet realized bodhicitta, and Serlingpa was a bodhisattva already, who had realized bodhicitta. So they give that example. So in other words, in that case, Atisha knew more than his teacher, technically, about emptiness. But on the subject he wanted to study, which was bodhicitta, his teacher knew more. Does that make sense? So, so that was an instance where it was on a particular subject. So that's clear, right? The teacher should know more than you about at least whatever you want to study. And what they say is, if you choose a teacher who knows less than you do, then you'll get worse, actually. Your practice will decrease and get worse. So you should definitely choose somebody who knows more than you do. The next one is the teacher should have joyous effort. So that means, right, that they should be, that means two things, right? One is, and it means for themselves and for others. In other words, that means they should be practicing Dharma, right? And they should be making, and also they should be happy. Joyous effort means, there's a difference between joyous effort and effort. Right? Joyous effort means happy to do virtuous things, right? So, like, it's not a good sign if somebody goes, oh, I guess I gotta do my water bowls, I don't feel like it. Like, that's not usually a good sign, right? Like, there is a sign of somebody who has joyous effort is they're excited to do positive actions, right? They're joyous, they're energized, they're, so that one you can check also, right? Does the person have that same quality of joyous effort? Sixth one is, the way it's sometimes written is they should be rich with quotations from the whole of the Buddhist scriptures. Really what that means though is this, is ideally the person should be really quite learned, right? Should have studied broadly and extensively. That's a good quality to look for in a teacher. You can take the example of Kensei Rinpoche, right? If you look at Kensei Rinpoche, right, like, actually, like, it appears that if you ask Kensei Rinpoche any question about any aspect of Buddhist teachings, he not only knows the answer, but he usually knows 3 or 4 different versions of it, right? Like, you could ask him the most difficult, like, a question that, I've tried this, like, questions I've asked many people, like, over the year, like, over the years, like, decades, where I'd ask somebody else that question, they said, I think maybe like this, and somebody else said, oh, I don't know, maybe like that. Right? And then I asked Kensei Rinpoche, and he says, well, there are 7 types of answer, and he would go through all, then he would go through all 7, right, and say, this sutra says this sutra says that, this other lama said this one says that, you choose which answer you like best. You see, that's a rich with quotation. That would be a quality of a person who's rich with quotations from the whole of Buddhist scriptures, right? Or even recently, when I was editing the book, I called Kensei Rinpoche. I was on Skype with him, and I was asking him questions, right? And I said, oh, this thing that said like this, is that correct? I wasn't sure if I heard it right. Because I sometimes thought it might be like this. And he said, oh, you thought that because, like his immediate right, he's like, oh, you thought it might be like that because it says that in this other text, and here's the exact way that applies. But in this context, it's better to, think this way. Then there's a third way that's done, where you could do it 7 times instead of 3, and that would be done this way. That would be done, there would be the meaning of that. So he goes through every possible, and then he says, and then I said, oh, so which one should we include in the book? And he said, well, why don't you include these 2 but leave this one out? But like that's not applicable to this context. But you see what I mean? Like any question you ask Kensei Rinpoche, it's like that, right? So that would be extensive. Rather than, and Pabonka Rinpoche also gives the example, he talks about this quality, right? Like that there are some teachers who like know 1 or 2 techniques well, right? They'll say, oh, well, I know, like they maybe know something about one kind of meditation, right? And actually, I want to emphasize this point, though, rich in the whole Buddhist scriptures, actually. Because Pabonka Rinpoche and also Lama Zopa Rinpoche emphasize this point, that if you choose a teacher who, let's say, has some of these other qualities but doesn't have broad learning, then there's a danger, which is that you won't learn the whole path to enlightenment. Right? And so then you can waste a lot of time just doing 1 or 2 techniques and maybe missing some important things for yourself. Does that make sense? So somebody who has that kind of broad learning and who at least can teach the whole Lam Rim, right, the whole stages of the path, but ideally if they've studied like the 5 great treatises and things like that, then they can give you a much broader perspective. And also, if you come to them with questions about practice, right, they can answer your question. Whereas somebody who's only studied a few things, either they'll pretend they know something they don't, which is not a good sign of a teacher, right, or they have to say, well, I don't know, like that doesn't really apply. All I know is this particular technique, right? Like I've just studied Mahamudra or something, right, but I don't know how to, then they'd have to say, well, but these details about an obstacle when trying to generate bodhicitta, they won't really answer, right? Or they'll make up some answer or something. So either way is not good. So a broad learning is a good sign. Does that make sense? And again, this is one you can check, actually, right? If you get to know a teacher and listen to them teach and ask them questions, well, it's not that hard to figure out if somebody has broad learning or not. And some teachers, I've seen that, where they have some of the other qualities, but they don't have this one. They didn't study it. And also, it's possible to have this quality and not the others, right? So you can check. Then the 7th quality is having understood emptiness. And sometimes that's differentiated from the previous one in the sense that this one really means ideally should have realized emptiness. Or it's not just understood it intellectually, but this quality really it means that they should have realized emptiness. The 8th is that they're skillful in teaching students. And that one's important, right, in the sense that, somebody could have a lot of learning but not teach well. Right? That's possible. And it actually happens sometimes. And in particular for this one, I just want to say this too, this is my own, I'm just elaborating a little bit, so I don't remember if this is in the teachings or not. But particularly it should be skillful in teaching you, actually, right? In other words, so that their teaching somehow influence your mind. That really makes a difference, right? So, if you go to somebody and they seem to have other qualities, but when they're talking, it just strikes you like a professor or something. Like it's information, but it doesn't seem to be touching you or affecting you, then that doesn't mean they're not skillful, but it's worth checking. It's like, that one should be checked more until you really get a sense, oh, they really are skillful. And again, I just want to give an example with this one, like that I've noticed over, I'm sharing like an experience because it's my own content with many teachers, but in regard, I was thinking of Khenso Rinpoche just recently about this one. Because if you watch Khenso Rinpoche, you notice a couple things. One is he leads different, he doesn't give the same advice to everybody. Right? And then if you watch, like for me it's been really moving to watch his other students, right? To watch other people and see them change so much over 5, 6 years, right? And watching going, wow, like this person 6 years ago was like this and now they're like that. And this person was like this. And you know, and sometimes the advice that he gave them and the way he guided them was completely opposite. And there was one person he said, you know, do more practice. Another person he said, no, don't do too much retreat, you know, go out in the world and do stuff. And somebody else he said, you know, like, you know, help others. And somebody else he said, no, study. And, you know, and somebody else he said, do this kind of you know, don't do tantric or do tantric. You know, everybody was unique, the advice. And yet when you watch over 6 or 7 years, you're like, wow, each person is totally, whereas that advice fit their mind so well that they're like, sometimes I looked at it and I thought, wow, it's like a different person in just 6 years. Like their whole life is different because they follow, you know, if they follow, now it's different if they didn't follow the advice, that's a different question. But if they follow the advice and you see that, then you go, wow. And like, and with Lama Zopa also, it's unbelievable sometimes. Like he gives advice that sometimes I would think, wow, like when he would give the person advice, I think, wow, I can't understand that at all. And then I watch the person and a year later, it's like, wow, like, you know, in his case, something it's almost like miraculous or something, like the advice that Rinpoche will give, and then you see, like, if the person does or does, I've seen that in both ways with Lama Zopa. I've seen people who, he gave some advice, I thought, wow, that was powerful advice, I wonder where that's comes from. I've seen people who didn't follow it, and then their life, you know, I see them a year later, and they're like, wow, I wish they'd followed, you know, you think, gosh, they really should have followed that advice, because their life completely fell apart. You know, he saw something in them, right? And then the opposite also, where somebody got some advice and followed it, and then their life completely takes off in a new way. So my point there is that skillful in teaching students, you can actually observe if you watch somebody over time, but also if you watch their students over time. But again, you have to differentiate if they follow the advice or don't follow the advice. Because if somebody doesn't follow the advice and then it doesn't work, then that's, well, actually that can be a sign the advice was correct or not correct, I don't know. But if somebody follows the advice and they change, then that's a good sign. Right? Then the next one is compassionate to all beings, but especially to disciples. Right? So that means they treat you with compassion, right? And there are other students. And this one's important also, like, again, I'll just give an example of this one. I remember once watching, oh no, I'll play that next one. Anyway, I mean, I guess compassionate to all beings, particularly disciples, right? You can feel that, actually, can't you? In other words, if you're with somebody, I mean, but you should do it over time, again, to make sure that it stays consistent. But and also to check, are they compassionate to all their disciples, or are they just the rich ones? Are they compassionate to all the disciples, or just famous ones? You know, how do they treat you, but also how do they treat the worst disciple, right? How do they treat the person who seems really difficult? And that relates to the next one, which is never being discouraged in teaching and benefiting disciples. So these two go together in a way. But that last one, never being discouraged, I want to say two versions of that. One is, especially, again, I'm just, I guess, I don't know really some experiences, but with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, sometimes I look and I think, wow, he's saying the same, like I look and I realize he's saying the same thing over and over because people aren't practicing, right? And so he comes back and he says it again, and then he goes, and he said, and like, you realize this quality where, and he moves on once the person realizes that, right? But it's like he has to keep going over the same, and you don't see him ever complain or say, you know, what's wrong with you people? Why didn't you practice this hard? Never once, right? Like, he just keeps presenting those teachings with love, right? In this very loving, sincere, like totally engaged way of the person. You know, and then like, he comes back 3 years later and they haven't practiced one bit, and again he does it like with totally sincere, you know, love. And you can see like he's so sincere in explaining it, you know, and then he comes back again and does it again. You know, it's because the people don't. And also, I want to share another one with that. Like, I remember one time, Lama Zopa Rinpoche had explained, what was it? It was in Boston. He had explained like in great detail the importance of motivation, right? Why motivation is important. And he had like gone through a huge teaching on, you know, the importance of bodhicitta motivation, right? And then like there was a guy there who I happen to know was, I knew him just very vaguely. He was a mentally ill guy who was kind of homeless and very aggressive. And he started insulting Lama Zopa. He said, that's bullshit, kind of, you know, and like, doesn't matter what, you know, I just want food. I don't care what their motivation is, and that's it. You know, it kind of was very insulting. And I remember like going, wow, it's like, you know, people don't usually talk. It was kind of like much more rude than anybody usually would talk to Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche was so kind. I think he spent the whole rest of the teaching talking to that guy, just answering his question. Kind of ignored everybody else and taught that guy, like explained in many different ways, like why motivation would be important, how it would apply to that guy's life, and how that guy's experience was related to that, and then gave another extensive. And then at the end of the teaching, went over to that guy and like held his hand, and you can see the guy was like totally pacified by that, right? And I thought, wow, that that was an example to me of both these, compassion and also not being discouraged, right? And also of, so we say, you could look and see, okay, this is not somebody who could ever benefit. That guy's not going to help the center. He's not going to help Lamas Open anyway. He's not going to help the, it's not like he's going to get, you watch, you go, okay, he's not getting anything out of, there's no ulterior motive, right? It's only to help that person, right? So there's this quality of patience and of compassion here. And so again, these are things you can observe, right? Especially, it's a good one, right? If somebody insults, that would be actually, you could plant somebody. If you don't know how to check up on a teacher, you could plant somebody, get somebody to come in and insult the teacher and see what happens. If you really want to check up, that'd be a quick way, right? Get somebody to kind of like do something. I'm joking, but that's a way to check up, right? So, and then I want to say also, so and then there are other lists from the Guru Puja, like knowledgeable and so on. But I want to say, let's just stay with those 10, right? So, does that make sense? It's your responsibility to check if a teacher has those 10 qualities, and you shouldn't take somebody. And actually, then Lama Tsongkhapa actually says, and Lama Zopa says, but Lama Tsongkhapa says, so in degenerate times, it can be difficult to find somebody with all 10. Actually, Lama Tsongkhapa says that. And he says, so then if they don't have all 10, they should have most. Right? If they don't have most, then they should have at least one. Or something like that. But actually, I want to say, like, in our time, actually, there are a lot of teachers who have all 10. There are a lot of teachers who don't have any of those. Maybe. There are a lot of people who don't have any of those, and there are a lot of teachers who don't have most. But in our time, for whatever reason, we have some kind of good karma right now on this planet. There are many teachers around who have all 10 qualities, actually. And there's no doubt, right? Like, take the example of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, right? If you run through those, right? I mean, the patient, like, look at, he's called what? Like, he's called the worst things in the world, right? By the communist Chinese government every day, right? Every day there are huge news, and somebody pointed this out. They said, we get upset if one person doesn't like, if one person at work doesn't like you, right? That you get so upset. If one person says you're a jerk, right? That you can't go to sleep that night. What happened? Like, why do they think that? And he has like billions of people, actually, right? Like, there's who despise him, right? There's because they're taught that in mainland China, right? And yet he has total peace of mind, right? Like, he said, how does somebody have if you compare, right, and then, like, it's unbelievable, and then the pace that he keeps up in terms of compassion, and actually there's no doubt, right, if you look at the Dalai Lama's face, right, like, even with like thousands of people there, there's no, like, you can feel and like ethics, right, you just, like, again, he's somebody who's so much in the public eye, right, if he did one thing wrong, actually the Chinese would, and also the media would love to report it, right, but so it's easy to check up on him, and the Dalai Lama is so easy to check, right? And it's so easy to see he has all the joyous effort. Oh my goodness, right? Like, whereas it's almost like, you almost get like, if you actually think about the activities of the Dalai Lama, you almost get like, I don't know, some kind of feeling of like, it's impossible. Right? Whereas when he was here, right? Like, you see, he met with President Obama. Like, he would come in, and how many hours? He would like 4 hours, and then he would go meet with the president, and then he would come back and teach for 4 hours, and then he'd go and do something else, and then he does 5 hours a day of meditation or whatever. Like, you say, that's not possible. Like, a human being can't do that every day. His Holiness does it for how many years now?
He's not young.
Yeah, and he's 76, 77.
Next week. Yeah.
Oh, he's 77
Next
week. So
Yeah.
you say it's impossible. You look and you say that's impossible. A person can't. If it weren't that he was here doing it, you would say a person can't do that. Actually, right? Not every day for 77 years, like, and so on. So, and similar, like when you look at the activities of Lama Zopa traveling, and even with a stroke, and he's traveling over the world, and he's like never, and people offer him so much, like, and you see also like in terms of attachment, or like I remember he was always like, people would offer him stuff, right? Like somebody would give, and he would like I think I've said, well, one is I remember like if I would give him something, right? Like I would find something I really thought was precious, and I'd go in and offer it to Lama Zopa. I'd come out, and then I'd be standing out there, and the next person walking out would have that precious, you're just giving it away. And then Tibetans used to take advantage of that. I think like sometimes people would offer, Westerners would come and offer money to Lama Zopa. So some Tibetan people knew, just stay at the end of the line, and then come up and then say, Rinpoche, I really need help, I don't have enough money. And it was give whatever people just game, he just gives it away, right? Like he gives it all, so there's no sense of, you watch his behavior and you say, it's unbelievable, like nobody does that, right? Like any ordinary person might say, well, I'll keep half and I'll give half away, right? Or something like that. But Lama Zopa would give it all away, like that, and even you look at like somebody gave Lama Zopa this really nice house, right? In Aptos, California, beautiful part of California, right? And again, any normal person would say, cool, house by the beach, Lama Zopa turned it into a nunnery, and there are all these nuns living there, and he rarely goes there. And when he goes, it's for like a week, and then he leaves. Like, so it's this beautiful house, but he gave it to the nuns, and turned it into a Pure Land Buddha art, like place for creating Buddhist art. So I'm just giving examples where you can check up on these things, and you can see actually there are people who have all 10 of those qualities. And then I wanted to say another thing briefly. I don't want to go into detail about this, but then. For Tantra, if you want to study Tantric teachings, right, or take an initiation, then there are additional 20 qualities. Because Tantric teachers have to be Mahayana, right? So that's why Lama Zopa listed 30 qualities for rebirthship, right? So if you want to take a Tantric initiation, then the person should have those 10 qualities for sure, right? They have to have those 10, and they should have an additional 20. So when you see a flyer that says somebody's giving an initiation, is it easy to tell if they have all 30 qualities? Like if it's just based on a flyer, you can't tell that, right? Like, and so with the Tantric ones, I won't go through all of them, but I'll just say in brief, they should include a few things. One is knowing the rituals very well, right? So they should include all those qualities of compassion and realizing emptiness and concentration. Then they should also include, these 20 qualities include a few different things. One is knowing a lot of different rituals. So knowing everything from like how to do initiations and how to do fire pujas and how to make tormas and all that. And also how to make those like protection amulets and all those kind of things. To also having tantric realizations, right? So in other words, they should know both. They should have both. So it's not just, a person shouldn't just know the rituals and they shouldn't just have realizations, they should have both. Does that make sense? So the person also should have gained realizations of the tantric path. And it's not, and so they should have both of those kinds of qualities, and there are other qualities too, so they should be able to do all kinds of tantric activities because they've gained some realizations in tantric practice. But I'm not going to go through all those in detail today, just time. But I guess first I want to pause and ask: are there questions about the qualities or about how to check or something? Are there questions about that? Because I want to raise one more issue today. But first I want to pause and see if there are questions. Okay. Well, what I want to do, and I think maybe we should do this as a small group. Maybe we just do 2 groups today, right? Because we don't have that many people. But here's what I want to have. Like next time we're going to talk about this in more detail, right? But the idea, I'll just say the idea, and I want to say something else about Guru, and then we'll do the group thing. So the idea in Buddhism is the idea in Mahayana Buddhism is this. So you need a teacher. So the first step is you're supposed to check up, right, and see, does the person have all those qualities, right? And then once you check up, right, it's totally, and I want to emphasize this too, it's your responsibility. In other words, Buddhism there's never been a stamp, right? Like the Buddha didn't stamp people, saying this person, Shariputra, you have a stamp. Whereas it's the student's responsibility to check that. And it's the teacher's responsibility to practice and all that, and to practice well. But in other words, but ultimately we have to take some responsibility ourselves to check up is one thing. But then I guess I want to say this. So in the Stages of the Path literature, it says you should check up carefully, right? And then once you choose to have somebody as your teacher, and that process can happen in different ways. One is you can just choose mentally, right? One is you can't choose if somebody's your teacher if you never meet them. Actually, then they're not your teacher, actually, technically. But if you take a teaching from somebody and you say, one is if you make a decision, this person I want to view as my guru. That's one way of doing it. The second way of doing it is actually to ask the person. Right? But it's only Dalai Lama, that's not often possible. So it's possible to just go and say, I choose to have the Dalai Lama as my teacher, right? And then you take teachings and it's like that. If it's somebody less, who's less busy than that, you can actually go and ask them. Or then there's another way, is there are certain activities, if you do them with a teacher, you automatically, if you're practicing Buddhism, don't do it with somebody unless you want to take them as your teacher, because you automatically take them as your teacher. Does that make sense? Kind of? Those are, if you take refuge from somebody, if you take vows from somebody, or if you take an initiation, a tantric initiation from somebody, that by definition they become your teacher according to the Buddhist tradition. Does that make sense? So if you say I'm going to go to initiation, but I'm not sure I'm taking this person as my teacher, then you're not going. Then something's wrong. Does that make sense? So you don't go to you don't go and take the bodhisattva vow from somebody, and then say they're not, or just don't take it if you don't want them to be your teacher. Does that make sense? Because it's like an automatic relationship that you're entering. It's like saying I'm not sure if I want to spend. It's like saying I don't know if I want to spend time with somebody, but I'm going to marry them. That doesn't really work that way. Right? If you choose to go through that ritual of marriage with somebody, it means you're probably going to be spending some time with them. So the same thing. In other words, if you go through the ritual of an initiation with somebody, but say I'm not sure if I wanted them to be my teacher, it's like that. Does that make sense? But then there's another thing which I want to mention, because I think this is where it leads to the discussion topic today. So once you take someone as your teacher, according to and this is the radical part that I was going to wait till later in the class, but I think it's good to bring it up today. Then you're not supposed to change. Actually, they're your teacher, then they're your teacher. They've represented all the Buddhas to you, and so on, and so you're supposed to keep that relationship with them and not disrespect them. And ideally, you're supposed to see them, as I said, as either a representative of the Buddha or as an emanation of the Buddha. So what I want to raise is this. What I want to ask people to do in just two groups, split up into two groups and just for 15 minutes talk about, is your concerns about it. I think people should have concerns about that. If you haven't, unless you've meditated a lot and practiced very extensively, it's like, there should be qualms, I think, about that, right? Like, first of all, from our cultural point of view, what does that mean? You view somebody as your guru? Like, that doesn't really fit our culture. But then another is, aren't there dangers involved in that? I'm going to see them as a representative of the Buddha, I'm going to see them as an emanation. Well, what if then something goes wrong? Right? So I want people to get up into groups and just talk about, because I think it's, over the course of this module, I think we need to address together what those concerns would be. But I think it's normal, I guess what I'm getting at is I think it's normal to have concerns a little bit, right? Like in other words, before people get married, right? Oftentimes, especially in our culture, there's an archetype of guys kind of being like, oh, I don't know, or something like that, right? What's that called? Like on the wedding day, everybody gets nervous, right? Or something like that. Even both genders get nervous, right? It's because we feel like it's a big commitment, right? Like in other words, oh, that's a big commitment. I don't know if I want it. What if something goes wrong? What if the person, so there should be a little nervousness. Does that make sense? I think to me that's not a bad sign. It's a good sign that you're taking the question seriously. And I'll say also I've known some people like that who were pretty slow at deciding to take someone as their teacher, and they went to classes and they thought about it, but they didn't. And many of those people actually ended up being better students. Where some people who said, "Oh no, I don't have any qualms. They're really cool," and "Oh wow, they're like so," and then like you see later that person, because they didn't ask the questions early on, then later those doubts come up and problems come up. So it's better to address those problems now than later. So that's why I think it's good to raise the question. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's break up into two groups and just for 15 minutes talk about what concerns you would have or think are reasonable to have about taking someone as a guru. I want to start with a broader answer, which is like, because I think it's getting at partly also a cultural issue that's there, a cross-cultural issue. And so I want to say something a little bit about, like, I don't know, because I think that, I'm actually going to answer it very broadly for me. Like, because Tibetan lamas, their cultural context is is incredibly different from ours, right? Like the context in which they grew up. Both because Tibetan culture is hugely different than American culture, quite different. And then also, they're not just Tibetans, they were raised in a monk. Most of them were raised as monks from childhood, right? So, put aside that they're Tibetan, which makes them usually different, but also they were raised by mostly other monks, like, and grew up around other monks. So, their whole context is hugely different. And so, this doesn't yet answer your question, but I want to say something broad about that too. A couple things. One is, like, so one thing I'll say, like, I'll just share this. When Tibetan lamas first come to the West, it's very predictable to watch, if you watch, because I've been around a number of times now, that like, at the beginning when people, and again, this is not what you asked, but Americans start coming with their personal problems, right? Like, and then it's almost humorous, because especially these young geshes who have only spent time with other monks, you know, and they're maybe, let's say, 28-year-old, 30-year-old guy who studied Buddhism their whole life and meditated. And then people start coming and going, you know, so like, you know, whatever, this sexual problems in my marriage are like this, and what should I do? And also I'm emotional about it. You know, and they're just like going like, I have no idea what you're talking about. You know, and not just sexual, but you know, just like relationship problems, and you know, and I think sometimes they're looking like, so is this an American thing, or is this like, you know, like what's going on? And they're trying to figure it out, you know, and they're trying to put in the context, they're trying to give a compassionate answer from the perspective of Dharma, but it's challenging, I think, sometimes, because a couple reasons. One is they're monks, but secondly, in Tibetan culture, also, and again, this is not what you asked, but I'm just elaborating a little bit. Also that also Tibetans don't. First of all, they, you know, first of all, like first of all, like Tibetan lamas aren't like therapists. In general, they don't do that, and then also they're not really like priests either. In other words, like people don't come and do confession to them either. That, you know, like the way Catholic priests, that's not their role in Tibetan culture. And also, Tibetans don't, even among the monks, actually, you know, like and this is why FPMT suggests, and this is why I lead this course the way, you know, in a very Western way, which is what FPMT is doing in part. But also, like, Tibetan lamas don't talk even much about your experience. There's like, they're not really that, you know, if you say, well, I meditated and today I had this experience, and wasn't that, you know, like, for the most part, the monks don't come and do that. I mean, it's one thing if you're doing a retreat, you know, they might do that. If they're doing a retreat and they say, well, I had this experience, what should I do? That they do. You know, so, but they don't come and talk about their emotions. Whereas they don't come, like if they say, well, I felt really sad today, and I felt this, and, you know, like, and what should I, you know, how does that affect my meditation? You know, like, for the most part, that's not part of Tibetan culture, and that's not part of the monastic. Like, the lamas teach, and if they have a philosophical question they ask, and then they say, well, go, you know, figure it out. Like, you know, practice, and you'll see. You know, like, you'll figure out the answer for yourself, and there's a kind of, you know, the Buddha even said that, right? You know, ultimately it's your response. You know, it's like I taught, and ultimately it's your responsibility, right, to practice and to, you know. So that's one part. That's not answering your question, but I just want to say in a general way that is also, it's a cultural difference. In other words, we're sort of used to talking about, you know, well, I was thinking about that, and it made me remember about with my, you know, parents when I was young, and we went on vacation, and I cried, and, you know, and like, you know, and like that's our culture now. And I think in Tibetan culture they would go like, you know, I think they would probably say, why are they talking about that? What's the relevance? I don't get it. You know, like, and you know, and it's not, they're not even being critical. It's just like they're going, well, what, like, you know, what do you mean? Like, they're almost like, well, what do you mean? Like, you know, and then they get used to Westerners and they answer, you know, they just do that. But there is a big cultural difference there. Yeah. I think I've told a few that when I asked Ken Rinpoche about it, he didn't want to talk about it, right? About his child, you know, about his life at all, you know, even like about his leaving Tibet and never seeing his mom again, and never seeing his dad again. Yeah, and he was just like, yeah, so I had to leave, and we walked, you know, there was no like, you know, I mean, you know, any American person like, oh, and then, you know, it was so difficult, and, you know, like, there's just none of it. It doesn't, my inner process, you know, like, and actually if you read American, even I mean, not just American, but Western novels, right, like, they're all about the inner process and, you know, and what the character is going through, and, you know, like, grasping and attachment and emotion, you know, and all these, like, kind of like explaining the afflictive emotions in great detail. And like, I think from the monastic point of view, they'll say, well, you know, well, that's one of the delusions, you know, what's the antidote, you know, that would be their thought about that, I think. So, for the most part, not exclusive. Of course, if somebody's grieving and they talk, I mean, it's not, like, I'm exaggerating maybe slightly, but not that much, I don't think. Not my experience. You know, and not that they don't have emotions. Of course, everybody has emotion. I mean, but first of all, like, I mean, the real lamas, their emotions are totally different anyway. Actually, their emotions are mostly just love. You know, then I felt extreme love, then I felt extreme compassion, and then now we bragging, so they don't talk about it, so then there's nothing left to talk about. You know, because like, in other words, if they talked about their emotions, they would only be talking about compassion. Then that would seem like bragging, so there's nothing to talk about, right? In a way, for them. I mean, because they don't have some of the emotions that we do. And then I think the younger monks, it's just not the cultural. You know, they certainly have emotions, but I think it's not the cultural expectation. And that's not what they talk about with each other. You know, they don't just sit around and chat about that stuff. So anyway, so that's that part. But then about, that's different from Dharma, you know, having Dharma questions, right? And I guess what I want to say about that is this: is on the one hand, you know, I think there are two sides to that. One is it is difficult a little bit because many, you know, like if you think of like, you know, if you want to ask, you know, I should say this right. It depends who your teacher is, right? But if your teacher is His Holiness the Dalai Lama or even like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, right? Then it's very difficult, right? Like because they're hard to ask questions of because they're so popular, and they have so many thousands and thousands of students. So then it's quite difficult, right? And then you know, Khenchen Rinpoche is much more accessible than much more accessible than His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but much more accessible than Lama Zopa Rinpoche also. You know, because he has more. Doesn't have as many thousands of Western students. So he has many students in the monastery, but they have other teachers there, I guess. So anyway, so he has more freedom, freedom time to answer questions. But I want to say this though. So this is just my own personal advice to people. It is good to ask questions actually of someone like Khenchen Rinpoche and even of Lama Zopa Rinpoche actually, I would say. On the one hand, of course, like you know, on a practical level, one can't ask them every week, right? Like it's not possible. You know, even Khenchen Rinpoche is much too busy to do that. But well, I'll just share my personal experience. Like what I personally do is if I have let's say a question comes up for me in my study, in my reading, in my meditation, in my thinking. What I personally do is like I'll write it down and I'll think about it first, right? See if I can figure it out myself or look up the answer in a book. If I can't do that, then I'll ask. Occasionally, I'll ask somebody. If I think a friend might know the answer, I'll ask them. You know, like like a friend who's been studying for a while, and may call up somebody and say, "What do you think about this?" And you know, and then sort of sometimes just by talking it through with somebody, then I get the, you know, like I have one friend who maybe even if he doesn't know the answer, his and I talking, then I'll realize, oh, that's the like it becomes clear, like oh, that's obvious. And sometimes you just need that, and that's the equivalent of what the monks do in debate. You know what I mean? Like there was like the monks don't. Actually, if you think of the monastery, right? The Lama teaches, then the monks go off and debate, and that's their way of processing it, right? So many times they come up with the answer themselves. They look it up in a book. It's the same what the monks do, or they through the debate you figure it out. Well, we don't have debate with other monks, right? But that's the purpose partly of these little groups and of those kind of things is if you can because actually it is better if you can figure out the answer on your own. Actually, you'll have it in a deeper way in some sense because you came to it through your own study and contemplation. But if you can't come up with a clear answer, if you're still not sure, then you should ask it. Actually, it's Khenchen Rinpoche said it's part of the perfection of wisdom practice to ask questions. So then you should ask your teacher. So what I usually, this is again my own personal advice, is what I would suggest is so write them down, think about them, and if you can't come with a clear answer, then come up with these, like, you know, save them for a little while until you come with a few questions that are really like important to you, that you really think this question, you know, either it's important in my practice, or I feel like this sense of I want to really know the answer, or it's important in some way in my intellectual understanding of Buddhism, but I can't get it. And to me, then I think it's smart either to, so once you have like 2 or 3 questions like that, then I would really strongly advise you to ask Khenchen Rinpoche, or even write a letter to Lama Zopa. You know, if somebody writes a letter to Lama Zopa, it may take a long time to get a response, but many times people do. And you know, Helen used to come to this. She wrote a letter, I think, you know, to Lama Zopa, and it took a long time, but the answer was incredibly profound. I mean, he gave really deep, profound answers to her questions that were very moving, you know, and wonderful. So my advice is it is really important, and I want to say a couple of reasons why. One is, you know, if they're your guru, it's your own practice, the perfection of wisdom, right? Your wisdom will increase by asking questions. Then also, it increases your karmic connection with them, right? Like in other words, like by having that relationship. And also, it's part of your responsibility as a student, actually, to ask questions and to, you know, have that, so that your practice becomes real in a way. And also, that's the way you get more appreciation of their kindness. And also, that's one of the many, you know, there are different kinds of teachings actually teachers give. So, you know, one, like teachers can give initiations, and they can give oral transmissions, like of a mantra or of a text, right? Then they can give explanations and so on. But one of the so there are many different kinds of teachings, but one of them is personal advice, right? That's on the list of, and you don't ever get personal advice in a public teaching. Right? So there comes a time where you have to ask, you know, and actually I want to say one more benefit of that. I want to say one more reason. Actually, I don't know. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said also. He points this out, and we're going to go into more detail about this next class. This is the last thing, then we'll stop to do the food thing. But Lama Zopa Rinpoche often points out, he says, so the guru is the supreme field of merit, right? Like in other words, that's in the Guru Puja and in many teachings in the Lamrim it says that, right? And so Lama Zopa Rinpoche points this out, that the fastest way to become enlightened, actually, is to receive advice from your guru, if you have a guru, and then follow it. That's the quickest path to enlightenment. And if you study the life of Milarepa, which we assign, then you're going to see that. Right? How did Milarepa become enlightened in one lifetime? Because of his relationship with Marpa. And so Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, he gives an example in this book. He says, if you do a retreat, right? Let's say one person does a retreat, but then somebody else does a retreat having received the advice to do that retreat from their guru. The person who received the advice and is fulfilling the advice of their guru, the retreat actually creates much more purification and positive karma because they're following the advice of their guru. Does that make sense? And so it's not just intellectual questions, but practice questions are very important to ask, because that only your guru can answer, right? Like in other words, if you do that, actually just asking the question and then fulfilling the advice, it deepens your relationship with them, and it's the supreme way to progress to enlightenment quickly. So I would also differentiate, there are like kind of intellectual questions, right? But then there are also like, well, I want to do a retreat, which retreat should I do? Or I want to, I want to do a certain extra practice every day. Which one would be smart for me? I'm thinking of this one or this. And I would suggest narrow it down. But and I wanted to say one thing about that too, though, from my own personal experience of myself and watching other people, so it's really beneficial to ask those kind of questions. In other words, it helps your practice a lot, but don't ask if you're not going to do it either. In other words, so don't ask the question if you don't want to. Like don't say I'll go anywhere on the planet. Where should I go? And then they say, well, Mongolia would be great, and you say, oh no, I can't go. No thing. In other words, don't say it that way. In other words, ask a question you want to know the answer to, and that you're So if you say I'm thinking of going here or there, which is better, then that's for that person who's only willing to go 2 places. That's a better question, right? For Ani Sarah, who is willing to go to Mongolia, then it's a perfect question. I'll go anywhere, right? Because she's now in Mongolia, so it's perfect. So you have to ask the question according to your, and like, don't say, I'll do any retreat, what retreat, here's a 3-year retreat, right, which they wouldn't say, but I'm just saying, like, I have a week to do a retreat, what retreat should I do? In other words, like, ask the question that you want to know the answer to. Don't ask a question, don't ask a question you don't want to know the answer to. But it's very profound to get those kind of answers. So I always suggest very strongly to ask those questions of Cancer Rinpoche. Again, but to do it sparingly at the right time for you, but to really save up those questions, but ask those questions, and especially the ones of like practice. It's a huge benefit to you. So actually, so we should stop there. Let's briefly dedicate the merit. So we can let's just think those 2, right? So one is, since we're going to do more dedications after, the Supreme Jewel Bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Has arisen, may it not diminish, increase more and more. And in the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig and Zingyatso, please remain until samsara is dead. Actually, and also let's make sure we dedicate, right, that may we, ourselves, and all other sentient beings always be guided by fully qualified, perfect Mahayana lamas. And by following, by finding those perfect teachers and following their advice, and may we all achieve as quickly as possible the result of becoming fully qualified, enlightened guides